Good morning, everyone. I'm Steve McMillan, Chairman of the Finance and Capital Committee. This morning, we will begin our activities with our safety contact from Chief Safety Officer Teresa Impastato. Teresa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. From December 6th through 12th, 2020, the CDC will be observing National Influenza Vaccination Week. National Influenza Vaccination Week is an annual observance in December to remind everyone 6 months and older that there's still time to get vaccinated against flu to be protected during the upcoming season. Vaccination is particularly important for people who are most vulnerable to developing serious flu complications, including people with certain chronic conditions such as asthma, diabetes, and heart disease. In fact, last flu season, 9 out of 10 of adults hospitalized for flu had at least one reported underlying medical condition. This year, that message is more important than ever, especially given the possibility that both flu viruses and the virus that causes COVID-19 will spread this winter. This will place a tremendous burden on the healthcare system and result in many more illnesses and hospitalizations than during a regular flu season, especially among people managing chronic conditions, because many of them are also at higher risk from COVID-19. The good news is that there is a flu vaccine proven to reduce the risk of flu illness and hospitalizations. There's so much that's beyond control this winter season, but we do have the power to get a flu shot to protect ourselves and our families from flu and its complications. Influenza vaccination during the COVID-19 pandemic is of added importance because it can help reduce the overall burden of respiratory disease and save medical resources for the care of COVID-19 patients. Together, we can use National Influenza Vaccination Week as a call to action to encourage everyone 6 months and older to receive an annual flu shot, especially those with chronic conditions. The more people vaccinated against the flu, the more are protected. Flu shots are available throughout the National Capital Region through local medical providers, pharmacies, and in supermarkets. Getting vaccinated will protect yourself and your loved ones from flu this season. This concludes today's safety briefing.
Thank you, Ms. Impastato. Good morning again. Welcome to today's special Finance and Capital Committee meeting, where we'll be discussing Metro's proposed fiscal year 2022 budget. Since this is our first and only meeting of the day, I'll ask Board Corporate Secretary Jennifer Ellison to call the roll.
Thank you. Chair McMillan?
Here.
Vice Chair Meridian?
Here.
Director Slater?
Here.
Director Smedberg?
Here.
Alternate Director Rouse?
Here.
Director Gideby?
Here.
Director Goldman?
Here.
And Director Letourneau?
Here.
Mr. Chair, you have a quorum.
Thank you. For staff presenting today, please be sure to introduce yourself with name and title. First of all, I'd ask that I trust everyone has had a chance to review the agenda. If there are no objections as presented, we will consider it approved. No objections? Okay, the agenda is approved. We have minutes from our previous meeting before us for approval. Are there any objections to the minutes as presented? Hearing none, we'll consider the minutes approved. So on to the agenda item for today. Having approved revisions to Metro's fiscal year 2021 budget last month, the board is now able to turn its full attention to the budget for 2022, which begins next July. Today, the general manager will present his FY22 budget proposal for information. The committee and board will be asked to act next week on December 10th at our regularly scheduled meetings. This would be the first of several actions the board would take before actual adoption of the budget early in the new year. Just like our current budget, Metro's fiscal outlook for next year continues to be driven by the effects of the ongoing pandemic, namely dramatic decrease in passenger traffic and associated revenue. So the impacts of that reduced fare revenue have been mitigated somewhat this year with the help of federal dollars. However, we have no ability to plan on any continued assistance at this point. So Metro is proposing a service plan that prioritizes essential travel and ensures that the network will be in place as the region begins to recover. We have come up with a plan that is going to be tough medicine for many of our stakeholders, but we have a responsibility to budget with the dollars we have available and provide the most logical and meaningful service that we can within those constraints. We expect that we will begin recovery during fiscal year 22, but we need to budget conservatively for a gradual return of our riders as economic and other activity begins to pick up. The proposal assumes that we will achieve approximately 34% of our pre-pandemic ridership during the course of that fiscal year. The consequences of this are going to require sacrifices from all stakeholders. Riders are going to see significantly reduced service. Employees will face, in some cases, layoffs or salary and wage freezes. And our jurisdictions who are coping with their own budget challenges will be asked to continue their commitments to Metro during this time. We are responsible for producing a balanced budget, and so we have taken this very pragmatic and realistic approach to FY22. Today's discussion, as I noted, marks the beginning of a multi-month process that includes consultation with riders, with employees, with our jurisdictional and federal government partners. We will visibly and transparently work through this budget over the next several months to raise awareness about all that's at stake and actively partner with the general manager to explain the consequences of this to all of our stakeholders. I'll at this point turn the floor over to the general manager and his team for today's presentation. I'd note that Mr. Devin Rouse is participating in Mr. Horner's place since he's recused from this matter. And again, presenters, please introduce yourself before you begin, and everyone else, please mute while you're not speaking. Thank you. Mr. Wiedefeld.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is Paul Wiedefeld, the General Manager and CEO of Metro. What I want to do is today I wanted to go through some of our priorities for the, our core priorities going forward, take a look at some of our recommendations in terms of the operating and the capital budget, and review the budget calendar with you as well. Clearly, we're facing, as you just mentioned, Mr. Chairman, a historic, stage of the agency, and to be frank, of the community. We're looking at roughly, as you mentioned, a growth of ridership about approximately 34% going forward. And basically, which when we do all the math, which we'll walk you through shortly, it leaves us with a gap, an operating gap of almost $500 million. We're also going to be recommending that we do a one-time significant use of capital funds, basically to cover some of the operating or preventive maintenance that we normally would cover in the operating budget. And the reality, unfortunately, is that we could only, when we do all those things, we will only be able to provide a bare bones system out there. Again, trying to preserve the system so that when the economy and ridership comes back, we can start to ramp back up as quickly as possible. So just real quickly, in terms of what we're focusing on, clearly safe services will always be our #1 priorities. We've taken a hard look at what where demand is, and we're projecting it to be, and try to build service around that. We're very sensitive to the economic pressures that both the state and local governments are under, so we're trying to limit the subsidy growth there as much as possible. And also, we don't want to lose sight of some of the service equity issues that we've been starting to deal with, whether it's with rethinking the police and their operations and things of that sort, and also some of the efforts we've been doing on minority and small businesses. So we want to continue those as well in 22. But at the end of the day, we really need to focus on preserving the essential network for those people that need it the most at this time. In terms of ridership, again, this graph I think tells us so much. When you look to the left to where we were, as you may recall, pre-COVID, we were at some of the highest ridership we had seen in years, and then the dramatic drop. And to be frank, we've been relatively flat, particularly on the rail side of the equation. And as I mentioned before, the rail system provides us almost 80% of our revenues. So yes, ridership is up on bus, and as you know, we're not collecting any revenues right there right now because we're using the backdoor entries for there. So basically the ridership does start to come back. We project going into fiscal year 22. At this slope, of course, this can change. Unfortunately, it can change either way. It can change further down or plus. We all hope that it comes up, and we will be dealing with that issue and not that it's going further down. In terms of revenues, we do project increased revenues, both in fare revenues and non-fare revenues. So roughly you can see we're projecting almost $265 million in revenue, up from the 182 in our current budget. But again, when you look at pre-COVID levels in revenue, we're down roughly 70% on revenues. There are a number of cost drivers that will increase in fiscal year 22, and also some drivers for the subsidy in general. Additional costs related to COVID, operational increases, contractual, just things that are basically built in that literally occur automatically, insurance costs, for instance. And then subsidy growth. There are a number of things that we will be doing in 22. As you know, we're bringing Cinderbed back under Metro's operation. Silver Line Phase 2 is projected to be open. And then there's some increased safety support that we want for the MSC to provide them everything they need. And then we are suggesting a 3% subsidy growth cap as well. So the numbers work out, when we add those numbers, it's roughly $93 million of additional costs that we're projecting into next year. And this is just a breakdown of it. So there's the COVID expenses, as I mentioned, roughly 10.3. Collective bargaining agreements, we have collective bargaining agreements with 5 unions, which call for basically salary increases of roughly 19.5. We're estimating some inflation of roughly 5 million. And then there's basically just built-in cost growth with fringe benefits, whether it's workers' comp, pension, as time progresses. And as I mentioned, the additional subsidy requirements we need to open up the Silver Line Phase 2 and Cinderbed and the others, which gives us roughly a cost picture of almost $2 billion. So when we look at the revenues that I mentioned before, the roughly $265 million, the expenses of almost $2 billion, the operating deficit is 1.6, almost $1.7 billion. We are assuming that we will continue to get the subsidy level that we have in 2021, which is the 1.1 billion there. We're assuming the 3% subsidy cap growth. Silver Line Phase 2, again, the same issues I've talked about before. That still leaves us, when we do the math there, it leaves you with a $495 billion funding gap that we need to solve. As I mentioned, we also are going to continue to focus on the equity initiatives, both in the terms of the police. Also, I forgot to mention earlier, the bus transformation. Again, there's a number of things we're doing, with the different committees on that, where we're trying to get that to match some of the things we've heard through the bus transformation project, and to be more consistent with what we see across the region, across the nation. And as I also mentioned, procurement, both small business and minority efforts, we will continue in those in 22. And now I'd like to have Tom Webster, our Chief of Capital Programming, walk through the Capital Improvement Program.
Thank you, Mr. Wiedefeld. Again, I'm Tom Webster. I'm Executive Vice President for Strategy, Planning, and Program Management at Metro. Through the proposed Capital Improvement Program, Metro will continue to advance our priorities, improving system safety, reliability, and state of good repair. The capital program continues replacement and rehabilitation projects and programs, accelerates the delivery of projects to address overdue infrastructure and systems needs. We're continuing to integrate resiliency and sustainability into our capital investments and through our capital investments. The proposed program is consistent with the commitment to cap jurisdictional allocated capital contributions at a 3% increase. And the proposed program is funded in large part by dedicated funding supported debt. See here on this slide that the proposed baseline FY22 capital budget totals $2.6 billion. The proposed 6-year program totals $12.4 billion. And the 10-year plan and needs projection totals approximately $22 billion. Metro advances capital projects and programs through 6 primary capital investment categories, including rail cars, rail systems, track and structures rehabilitation, stations and passenger facilities, bus and paratransit, and business and operations support. The FY22 capital budget financial plan assumes federal formula funding and PREA funding, state and local contributions, 500 million of dedicated funding contributions, jurisdictional reimbursable project funding, and about 1 billion of debt supported by dedicated funding. Through the Railcar investment category, Metro will acquire new 8000 series rail cars to replace the 2000 and 3000 series cars that are approaching the end of useful life. We will continue to rehabilitate and maintain the existing railcar fleet. We will rehabilitate railcar maintenance facilities and rail yards and replace railcar maintenance equipment. And we will construct the heavy maintenance and overhaul facility. In rail systems, Metro will continue state of good repair programs for automatic train control systems and infrastructure. And we will continue planning and development of the modernization of that signal system. We'll continue to advance the rail power systems, state of good repair, replacement programs, and upgrade programs. And we will deliver the radio infrastructure improvement program and other communication system replacements. In track and structures rehabilitation, we'll continue the annual ongoing renewal of our track infrastructure. And importantly, we will be accelerating some major infrastructure projects to restore tunnels and bridges throughout the system. In stations and passenger facilities, we will continue to advance our platform reconstruction program with phase 3 and phase 4 beginning in FY21 and extending through FY23. I'll continue our life cycle replacement programs for elevators and escalators, as well as station systems, including lighting, cooling, and some of the behind the scenes infrastructure that supports stations. In bus and paratransit, we'll continue our bus replacement program, replacing buses as they reach end of useful life and become less reliable. Continue again our bus rehabilitation and maintenance programs. We're advancing our electric bus acquisition, test, and evaluation program, as well as Metro Access vehicle replacements. We're advancing the replacement of Northern and Bladensburg bus garages and beginning some rehabilitation activities at several other garages. Importantly, we're also advancing some improvements to customer amenities and things like bus shelters and bus terminals through this program. And we're continuing to partner with the jurisdictions to advance bus priority on the region's roadways. And the final category, business and operations support. These are the projects, again, sort of behind the scenes that support rail, bus, and paratransit operations, as well as administrative and financial functions. We're advancing the office consolidation project with office building construction underway. We are, again, preserving and replacing some of the core information technology systems that are necessary to support the operations and business of the organization. And then a collection of projects that, again, support the entire network, including roof rehabilitation, service vehicle replacements, and environmental compliance projects to address issues that come up over the course of the 6-year program. With that, Paul, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Tom. So I wanted to summarize the recommendations for the board's consideration. Let me just give you a little sense of the philosophy that we took. It was what can we do with roughly $500 million hole? What can we do to minimize the impact on service and to keep as many people employed within the agency so that we're prepared to ramp up into the future? Very, very difficult given the scale of this, but that was the general approach. So the first thing we looked at is what can we do internally? This is just a recap of the whole we're trying to solve. What can we do internally to try to save additional dollars? As you know, literally for several years, we've been taking several actions. As you remember, several years ago, we eliminated almost 800 positions, for instance. 21 budget, as you know, again, we cut further into the existing, infrastructure that supports everything else that we do. So in 22, we need to go further still. So on contractor cost reductions, we will be looking at, again, scrubbing every contractor we have, any chance we have to reduce costs. We're estimating roughly almost 8 million there. We will not be giving any additional salary increases to the non-represented employees, meaning those that are not covered by a union representation. This will be the second year for that to occur. I am working, and I have requested that the 5 unions that we have collective bargaining agreements with, that they defer their increases as well. So that is something I cannot do, that the agency cannot do on its own. It has to be done through negotiations. So we're starting those negotiations. The key point here is that roughly almost $20 million, we estimate saves roughly 200 employees, again, which allows us to provide service that is supported by those 200 employees. And then we will continue in terms of everything we can do to look for dollars to save money. We're estimating 21 million. Again, we'll look at retirement, obviously not filling vacancies, when people leave, for instance, and we'll continue to drive those numbers down as much as we can. So through this process, we've come up with roughly $56 million. The other major element, again, before we get to service, is I asked Tom to give me as much flexibility as I can on the capital program. And so what he has done is, again, given all the parameters that we have to work under with limitations of where you can use capital dollars, we are recommending, as you know, as a policy, the board has annually let us use about $60 million of preventive maintenance that normally would be charged the operating budget to be put into the capital program. In 21, the board allowed us to move an additional 30 million, which took us up to 90 million in fiscal year 21. In 22, basically, we're looking for another 160 million of operating costs to be shifted to the capital program, which takes us up to $250 million in the capital program that's covering, in effect, preventive maintenance that historically would have been in the operating budget. This is a short-term solution. It's not a long-term solution. It has the potential, obviously, of us delaying major capital improvements, much larger capital improvements into the future. So, but given where we are, it is a recommendation to try to ease the pain in this current year. So that then leaves us, unfortunately, with the only service recommendations, or the service recommendations that we have to put on the table to deal with the remaining shortfall. So on the Metro Rail side, we are recommending that we run the service only from 5 a.m. to 9 p.m. Monday through Friday, that we do not run weekend service, that we run 30-minute headways from the terminus points. Obviously, it'll be slightly more, roughly half that, where there's in a core system. And so we also are recommending that we close 19 stations, the same 19 stations we closed earlier in the spring when the pandemic broke out. Again, that's driven by either a lack of usage or limited usage or proximity to other stations. In terms of Metro Bus, we basically have come forward with a consolidation of a number of routes, trying to serve routes as best we can. The bottom line here is that we will be providing 45% of pre-pandemic service. To put that in a little bit of perspective, right now we're providing 75% of pre-pandemic service. So we're dropped to 45%. And let me just go back to the rail just so everyone understands that. Currently, we're providing roughly 50% of the rail service. Under the proposed recommendation, we'll be providing 20% of the pre-pandemic rail service. Another issue, obviously, is our advertising revenues will go down as ridership, again, as the ridership doesn't bounce back. So we're projecting a roughly $25 million hit for that. So with that, that leaves us with a savings of $279 million. to solve the remaining portion. Again, as I mentioned, is the $160 million that we will be using to fund preventive maintenance in the capital program versus the operating program, which again eliminates the funding gap that we have to deal with. Let me just add that all of these cuts in service, every cut is just as painful. It doesn't matter, where you are in the system. What we try to do is try to serve as many people as we could, where we've seen, particularly on the bus side, where we've seen demand high, and or where we see facilities that need to be served, for instance, like hospitals and areas that have no service and rail service. On the rail service, we've minimized that to save dollars, obviously, but we also have to provide a core service to both maintain that and be prepared to start to ramp that up in the future as this thing comes into greater focus of when the economy starts to rebound. A number of operating risks with the budget for sure. Clearly, when things start to rebound and how we can react to that. The customer service and clearly what their view of the limited service will be and how they will react to the limited service that we have. Service reductions, again, in trying to maintain social distancing, obviously will be impacted with the reduced service as well. And we also have to keep the budget in balance. There's a lot of, in effect, overhead associated. So when you cut jobs, you also have to then bring down the overhead associated with that. So we have to work through all those numbers as well going forward, which will mean we will have to take significant cuts in additional support services for the service we provide on the street. In terms of the capital program and some of its risks, some of these are, again, not new to us, but on the pandemic side, the impact in terms of delivering projects can be impacted by the pandemic itself, whether it's supplies or something occurs on a site. In terms of the federal reauthorization PREA, again, we're not assuming that in the out years. So that's an uncertainty, whether we can get that back. And then again, the regional economy and what the locals can support going forward in the capital program. Emerging needs, other things may come at us in 22 that we will have to deal. Things that we don't control per se, permitting, litigation, third-party issues come up in the capital program. And then just the service levels of the future as we start to think long-term about the future of the system, how that may change the capital program. So let me just wrap up before we take questions, with the schedule. As you know, we're already a month behind in developing the budget. Historically, we would start a month earlier. Dealing with the 21 budget, caused that delay. What we're looking again today is obviously to answer any questions you have and looking for approval to start the process in basically next year. But I need the approval so that we can start to prepare all the materials that we take out to the public. We need to do Title VI analysis, as you know. We need to prepare if there are any layoffs. We need to give the 60-day notice to the union members. And then also we need to get in our federal grants into the FAA by basically April. I also think it's very important to hit this schedule because I think we owe it to our customers and we owe it to our employees so that they understand that they can start to adjust the potential where we may be. I just don't think it's fair to leave them in sort of in the dark or in limbo. I think we really need to share with them as much as we know, as early as we know it, so that we can all adjust both our personal and professional, paths forward. So I think that's very important to hit this schedule from that reason. So with that, we'd be glad to answer any questions. We have a number of staff on the line as well that will help if we need to go into deep any question you may have. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Paul. I'll start just very briefly by reiterating the point you just made about the schedule. It's important for everyone involved to recognize that today is an informational briefing. Next week would be the beginning of authorizing a public hearing and consultation process that will go on for multiple months. That if in fact we have new circumstances and facts that would suggest some significant changes to what's being presented here today, we have time to absorb and react to those. But if we don't get this process started on the schedule we're proposing here, that has the effect of taking options off the table. So, for example, in the current fiscal year, we began the year with a budget that did not fully recognize all of the pullbacks, cuts, and things that we would need to make in order to get through the year with balance. When we delay the implementation of some of those savings measures, less time means more significant service changes in order to achieve the same dollar level of savings, correct? So, so to an extent, the same logic applies here. That as unwelcome as some of these service changes are going to be to many of our stakeholders here, if we don't initiate the process promptly, then we run the risk of losing some of the time that we'd be achieving those savings, and perhaps having to look at even more difficult choices further down the line. So for everyone listening here, I hope they will understand that this is not a decision that's being made today. This is the beginning of a process, and we will be absorbing a lot of all the input and opinions and analysis and new facts that come out between now and the ultimate adoption of the budget at the end of March. So I don't have any comments on the substance other than to say I appreciate what's been done to avoid significant changes to the capital investments that we're making. This authority didn't fund and didn't execute an appropriate capital program for too many years. Many of the problems that we have operating in the system these days can be traced to that situation. And if we expect this system to be there and available and safe and reliable for future customers, then those are investments we need to continue making while we have the opportunity. So I appreciate the focus on that, and I'll just leave it with that comment and move on to my fellow board members. So next, Mr. Meridian.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. General Manager, and Tom, for that presentation. And Mr. Chairman, I appreciate you clarifying where we are in this process, and that we are effectively moving forward here with the process, but not we're not voting on the substance of the content here. And along those lines, I will hold my questions on the substance and just ask if staff can share for the record information about any of the legislative exclusions per jurisdiction for the board's consideration.
This is Paul Wiedefeld, General Manager. In terms of legislative exclusions, obviously the Silver Line, any new service is an exclusion. Any safety related requirements, which is the MSC, is part of that. And so that's when you see those numbers, that's what's supporting that. Those are new services that are allowed under basically the dedicated funding regulations / laws that were passed in Maryland and Virginia.
Thank you. And Paul, if you could also just speak to how what we're looking at takes into consideration the possibility or the prospect of any additional federal dollars.
Yeah, so, we remain very hopeful. We're all following that very closely. If any additional dollars come, we would adjust these proposals. And I think you only need to look back at what we just did in the 21 budget. Where we started in September, basically we were, for instance, we were recommending reducing the Metro Rail service to 9 p.m. at that time. As we got actual dollars and saw we were saving more money, we could stretch out some of that. So we were able to bring that back in to 11 p.m., as you know. So the same thing would play out here. As we learn more, whether it's through ridership, whether it's through vaccine, whether it's through federal dollars, we can adjust and bring things back in. But as we all know, it's much easier to do that than to say, okay, well, let's assume all that has played out in our favor, but it doesn't. And then we got to go back out, at the pressure of basically starting a budget in July with the dollars not there. We need to give, I believe, the state and local governments our best guess of what the financial request is from them so they can build their own budgets. It gives them the sense of this is sort of the outer limits. Hopefully it comes in less than that. But at this time, none of us I don't believe can assume that right now. Again, it's much easier to come back, to bring things back in than to go back and start cutting things again.
Great, thanks. Mr. Chairman, I don't have any further questions at this time. Thank you.
All right, next we'll go to Secretary Slater.
Thanks so much, Mr. Chair. So just a couple of kind of comments and maybe some questions just to kind of think about now and later, recognizing kind of where we are in the process. But these are, certainly some pretty typical times. I thought it was tough in the recession in 2008 when I was trying to build a capital program, but this is just so much worse. Really, the way I look at it is I think because of how drastic it is. And so, it's really hard to predict where our ridership trends are going to improve. And we're dealing with a very similar situation on our transit system in Baltimore, very similar in terms of just trying to keep things rolling. I think Jeff asked a similar question in terms of ability to kind of adapt, which I think does make me feel a little bit better, but I am a little bit concerned about how kind of early we are. But I also understand the need to act and plan, and I appreciate the need to really understand on the partner side how we can build our budgets. I do think, reports of the vaccine are starting to be distributed in a few weeks, and I'm really hopeful that, those rises will become more widespread and ridership will start to come back. But, cuts of this magnitude are really going to kind of make it tougher to return when that comes back. So I'm trying to kind of think about the adaptability side. I think about, we're starting to anticipate a return. When I'm looking at a return anticipation of about 34%, I'm a little bit concerned that it's really conservative and we could be much higher than that. But I do, I appreciate the need to kind of plan for the worst and adjust for the best and kind of work through there. From a service perspective, I would like to understand some of the details kind of behind it holistically, kind of not just where the cuts are located, but some of the details behind kind of the impacts they'll have on the areas and connectivity, and as well as connectivity to other systems. From the county perspective, we have heard from our local governments on a couple of different issues. One is just their inability at this point, being in a similar situation, to make up some gaps that may be achieved. I have to point out that, we're a little bit concerned about some of the isolation it may leave with the proposal in some of our zero-car households, and especially in areas like Bowie and Suitland and Largo, southern Prince George's County, those types of things. From an economic perspective, of course, we have some concerns in Maryland with the layoffs as well. About 65% of WMATA's workforce, they're residents of Maryland. About 48% of that total workforce are residents of Prince George's County. So, we're very concerned about kind of the layoffs having kind of a disproportional effect on this kind of single locality. And then really kind of on the national side, frankly, I'll take this opportunity to say the WMATA and the entire national transit industry nationwide really needs help. And I really hope they're hearing us in DC, because these are impacts that are going to be felt for real people. And, I was hopeful earlier this week that bipartisan group from the House and Senate unveiled that $908 billion relief package, and that does include $45 billion for transportation, including airlines, airports, buses, transit, and Amtrak. I think about $15 billion of that is intended for public transit, and I'm sure that will help. But I really hope they're hearing us in DC, because we really need some help across this country with transit. And so just specifically on some questions, I'd like to see some additional details on things like, how we developed the list and kind of the thought process behind that. And I'm happy to kind of work with you on the side on that. The assumptions, kind of the data. I would like to understand a little bit of the input from the local jurisdictions as well, if that was kind of part of the process, or if that's part of the process now, as we're really early in this. But I really think would like to kind of understand a little bit more of that. But I think the board and many of us have some pretty critical and devastating decisions in front of us if we don't get help from the federal government. But we all have an obligation to have a balanced budget, and our industry is pretty devastated right now. So if we can't serve the people that need us at the time when they need us the most, the impacts are just going to multiply. But specifically on the questions, I'd like to understand kind of what options and alternatives were considered. I'd like to understand if there were any impacts on the non-represented employees outside of the kind of salary piece, if any of those positions are being eliminated. And I would like to understand a little bit of the long-term impacts projected on the capital side with some of the deferrals in terms of, have we kind of projected out increased costs later based on the deferrals that we're going to see now, just to understand that, recognizing that a lot of these are just the realities of some of the needs that we have. But I'll just kind of leave you with that.
Just, Mr. Chairman, this is Paul Wiedefeld again. Just a few comments to the Secretary. Yes, I mean, we are working with all the local governments. We've sent out all the cuts, particularly on the bus side, as they're particularly interested on the bus. I mean, they clearly can understand the rail fairly easily. So we've sent all that information out. It's actually on our website for the public. And this is something that, we want some give and take, right, back and forth now to see what makes the most sense. I know I just had, for instance, had a conversation with Montgomery County and their transportation people, and they want that so they can start to say, now let us adjust our own local service and see, where we can fill some gaps. So we'll continue to work with them. But again, our basic logic was, where is service performing where there's the demand now on the bus. So when we talk about a 45% of the service, or another way of looking at a 55% cut in service, it wasn't like every line gets cut at 55%. What we tried to do is say, now where do we see the need? And then also we took a look at sort of major generators that need to be served. Again, hospitals, supermarkets, those areas that have, very, very limited service or no other options. And so that's where we're trying to do that. We also went and redid the bus system for weekends. Since there won't be rail service on weekends, we've tried to backfill some of that. So that was some of the logic there, but we will work again with you and particularly the local governments, because again, they run their own bus networks in a lot of cases. In terms of the positions, yes, the non-reps, we will continue. Unfortunately, it's both in terms of potential layoffs and all that will occur there as well. As I mentioned, we need to work through, in effect, the associated support that side of the house provides the operations side. An example would be personnel. Payroll, right? So, when you start to think, okay, well, there's a difference on the service side, we've got to need to take a hard look at payroll. But at the same time, a lot of those functions, whether you have, 9,000 or 11,000 people, a lot of those functions still have to occur. So you got, so it's just not a one for one. So we are looking at that. In terms of long-term, I think, we have to think long-term for sure, and what that might mean in the capital program. But I think, our commitment on the capital program is, again, I think the chairman just talked to it, is the fear that we basically we don't do those investments, and we had dug a hole, we've been digging out of that hole. And the reality is we've gotten older and a lot of those things that, so it's not just digging out the hole, but things that continue to age out that we got to keep up with. So that is the plan. And particularly on the rail side, when you think of that large investment, you're in it or you're not, right? and we've seen when you're not, what happens. So we have to commit to that. And then I think long-term, I remain very bullish on transit in this region. As you know, you look at some of the things that are happening in New Carrollton in Maryland's case, you look at the Silver Line. I mean, that's not us driving that. That's the economic engine of this region driving those decisions of where they want to locate, where they want to invest, residential, office, retail. That's what they're doing. They're counting on us to be there. So I don't think any of that changes. And in fact, it grows. And that's where this region is going to be in the future. So I mean, I get we have to deal with the here and now, but I think we can't lose sight of what this system means to the economic, recovery / sustainability into the future, much less everything else that we do in this region, whether it's social, whether it's, cultural, anything else. That's what this system supports. None of that goes away. None of that goes away. But we're definitely in the we're in the fog of war right now, right? So things are tough right now, but I think we have to look a little bit longer term and remember the investment we made here and why we made it, and that I don't believe anyone's backed away from that.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you and appreciate your team's work as well as the situation that we're all dealing with today. But thank you.
Okay, Chair Smedberg. Paul, you're muted, I think.
Sorry about that. I just said thank you, Mr. Wiedefeld and Mr. Webster, for your presentation. It's obviously very, very sobering. I think it's the first time in recent history anyway, or if ever, that this authority has had to deal with a situation like this. It is really dramatic. And as the Secretary just said, it's not just WMATA, but it's systems across the country are all dealing with this, particularly the larger authorities, many of whom have already taken steps in this direction already, as we have as well. So it's going to be difficult, and a lot of good discussion, I'm sure, coming up. A few thoughts, Mr. Wiedefeld, even with let's say this bipartisan package goes through, when we are able to secure some transit funding, there is still a good likelihood that any kind of adjustments or anything will see pretty dramatic changes to the FY22 budget, barring any kind of, true all outright bailout. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I mean, we're all hoping that something occurs, in the very near future. I know it's tied to the current, budget cycle that the federal government's on, and hopefully we will get some dollars there. And then I think there's, some thinking about, when the new administration's in place, that they may, do some things. But as you know, state and local government's under tremendous stress as well. So we were very fortunate, meaning the transit industry, I believe, to receive what we received in 21. It kept us afloat for a very long time. And again, meaning the transit industry as a whole, but we've seen, that has deteriorated. So I'm hopeful that it will be as significant, and we continue to be able to provide the level of service we want. But I think we have to take a wait and see, approach to this, because I think there's a lot of other pressures, just from a political perspective, and then from a demand perspective, given all the other industries. I mean, you may have seen just this morning, Southwest has announced, the first time they've ever are moving forward with furloughs, for instance. So there's a lot of, part of the economic engines that are looking for those dollars. So, I just don't know how it will play out. I hope for the best, like we all do, but I'm very concerned that we will not probably see what we've seen in the past.
Yeah. And just to be clear, in terms of your process, I know you've said this to us, but for people listening or the press that's listening in on this, in terms of just general overall process, it's much easier to add things back into the budget than to try to take them away, so to speak. And I know it's the same on the local level as well. And I'm glad you recognized the localities, because I think the subsidy issue is going to be of concern. Mm-hmm. We know that, the district and the 3 states and localities on the Virginia side, how we're funded here, but, are going to be seeing some very challenging budgets for fiscal year 22, regardless of what kind of aid comes forward. And so appreciate the sensitivity there. And in terms of the timeline, I think it's important because a lot of I know the localities anyway, from my experience, and I know others on the call here, those budgets for 22 are well in final stages of a draft, and they need those numbers, and they too, it's much easier to adjust, to put things back in than it would be to add things later on. So I appreciate that. And it's a pretty, common practice that you go out with your sort of worst case, if you will, or top line, and then, you make your adjustments from there. Just some other comments. I think I appreciate that we're still able to advance many of the equity framework initiatives that we have been working on as a board. Obviously, the state of good repair and the capital project commitment, I think, is really important. As we've said earlier, we don't want the system to go back to where we were not that long ago. One area that we're hearing about, putting on my Virginia hat here for a moment, is the bus line cuts, more than 50%, and just doing some quick calculation. In Virginia, we're only going to have about maybe 8 of the bus lines with the proposed cuts. And I know I've heard from some of the jurisdictions already that, it is going to be very difficult for them. They've been augmenting their bus service, and they simply, A, won't have the money, and B, won't have the buses to augment, that service. So just, something that, I'm going to keep in mind, and I'm sure others are as well. Want to applaud you and appreciate your efforts with the unions, and thank them too for, being willing to listen and talk and be cooperative here. Everyone is having to sacrifice. Paul, could you, this projection of ridership, the 34% keeps coming up. What, could you give us just a little more detail as to the methodology, or what went into that thinking?
Yeah.
And I'm sure you looked at a whole range of possibilities or percentages, but what was your determining factor that led you to choose, the 34%?
Sure. Now, a few things. One of the things that we've been looking at very closely is our local airports, meaning Dulles, Reagan, and BWI, Baltimore Washington International, and what some of their projections are when they see, in effect, passengers coming back. And they have sort of a 23, 24 before they get back to a normal cycle. We've also looked at the hospitality industry and some of their projections, and they sort of are in that same time frame, 23, 24. Again, all saying that, yes, but if the vaccine, is fantastic and we're, at a certain stage much earlier, that can change, but they're not there yet either. So that's a big part of, as you know, we don't just move people to work, right? This region, this summer, if the museums and people aren't coming back for that tourism, we lose a lot of riders, right? During the summer. We already know, for instance, this Cherry Blossom Festival has been canceled, for instance, right? Those are big drivers of our numbers as you add those up through the year. So that's one part of it. So it isn't just, what we're thinking, but the other part of it is, as you recall, we've done a number of surveys and focus groups with our riders. And on the rail side, as I mentioned earlier, remember our revenues are driven by rail service. 80% of our revenues come from the rail side of the house. Remember, pre-COVID, 60% of the traffic is rail, 40% is bus. But that 60% drives 80% of the revenue because of the charging for distance and peak fares that we don't do in bus. What we continually hear, and we've seen it play out, is that the rail riders, in many cases, have choices. They can telework, they can drive, they can do other things. And they continue to tell us that until this, for lack of a better term, is almost in a rear view mirror, they are not going to be coming back. So it's not just that there's a vaccine, But it has to, I believe, what we're hearing from them, it has to take hold. It has to, be solved, right? Given the nature of the type of trips, the type of environment you're in. So, we want to continue to focus on the cleaning that we're doing, that this is a safe system to use that, but they get to make the final choice. And so, the final choice for them is when they feel comfortable getting back on the system. So that drove us a little bit to say, let's let this, hopefully, that we've underestimated and we'll come back and bring stuff up. But to assume that now, I think would be pretty hard, just given the experience we've seen, what we've heard from our customers, what we see other industries doing, what we see happening in the tourism side. All that needs to start to really draw that riders back, and to project that right now, particularly for this summer where we're very dependent on a lot of the ridership there, I think would be a pretty aggressive assumption.
And those rail riders are the ones that drive most of the authority's revenue.
Yeah, exactly. That's at the end of the day, they're 80% of the revenue.
Yeah, that are able to give us the funding to afford all this other stuff. Well, I appreciate that. And lastly, I think Mr. Wiedefeld, you and I over the past couple of days have been talking to various legislators, local and federal, and various groups. And, I think one thing is very clear. I think the efforts that we take as a board and you take as, with you and your management team and and other folks, they understand and we obviously appreciate the fact that Metro is the foundation block for any kind of recovery in this area. And they want to see a safe, clean, reliable Metro system. And I know there's commitment to that. I know it's going to be a rough period here the next couple months. But when you look at all the investment and effort that went into transit in this region and what it has done for this region economically and otherwise, I think we have to be, on top of things and, just considering it all as a whole and making sure that we have the strongest system possible, when we do come out of this. So, thank you.
All right, Mr. Rouse.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Yeah, this is tough. There's no way around it. And I think slide 6 certainly says a lot just in and of itself. How dependent we are in terms of fare box revenues, and particularly, as Jim just mentioned, rail, which, we've had that slide in there in the past pie chart that shows you percentage rail versus bus. And it really just underscores how dependent we are in the revenue structure that we have. I hope long-term we see this. It's not just a Washington Metro issue, it's a US issue. And I hope, one thing coming out of this, hopefully long-term, is we figure out different financial models for how we support transit systems, particularly when it comes to revenue opportunities, because this is what happens when you're so dependent on the ridership. And certainly even some of the ancillary revenue, like advertising, as was mentioned. There's no riders, there's less of a will for people to spend money on advertising on the system. So finding more different ways of diversifying that revenue opportunities is going to be important for systems going forward, but there's nothing we can do about that now, right? And so much of this is tough decisions, but I certainly agree with both the GM and the chair on this point of making expeditious decisions here and not waiting too long so we can have some certainty to build around. Obviously, we're all hoping for the best here and planning for the worst, but time is money too. Time's important, so you want to make decisions, give people certainty, so that we can plan and move things and adjust as needed. So that's certainly critical here. One thing I do think would help is the how and why behind what's being proposed, particularly from the service level. And I think Secretary Slater touched on this. Give us a little bit more about how you reached the conclusion of what you did in terms of what you're proposing here. I think that'll help with public outreach. It'll also help with all the board members here to get an understanding of where we are. I'm particularly interested in what you're proposing on the rail hour side and whether or not that's really intended to be a one size fits all, or if it's really, there's some more adjustments considered there as ridership changes. I mean, obviously the way this system was built, it's built to carry a lot of people, and that's really geared around certain hours of the day. And so, 30-minute headways are being proposed, but we're seeing ridership at certain hours of the day, traditional rush hour, or maybe something different, who knows. If that has additional patrons out there, are we going to be doing 30-minute headways at those times too, or are we going to support and try to support those ridership and get enough capacity in the system to support the numbers that we're seeing at those times? I think that's just of interest to me, because there are different paths we can take, and I agree it's hard to predict what ridership will be, but we do have very good data in terms of what the actual ridership is. And so if we're seeing trends where we're seeing more ridership during certain hours of the day, and we need to, it makes sense to add headway, I think that's certainly something that the model should be able to reflect. However, and what was touched on earlier on this question, the ability to expand, I would ask the GM or anybody else from the amount of staff if there's any major bottlenecks or limits to how we can expand service based on staffing, because obviously we have to make some tough decisions. We're going to have to downsize. And when you take something like bus drivers or train operators, it's not something where you can just staff up and go hire people the next day. So there's a curve of time of how long it would take to staff up to different levels of service. And I'm wondering if we know what that limit is, if we know if we've got some float built in, or what the thought is around that. I don't know if there's any comment on.
This is Paul Wiedefeld. Thank you for your comments. I think two things on again, what drove our recommendations is the demand that we've seen, right, where we're seeing it. On the bus side particularly. On the rail side, same thing. And also keeping, an eye on, just what it takes, as you know, to exercise, to maintain, a big infrastructure like that. But I also think it's important, we're going to, for public hearings, right? We're going to hear things, and it will be adjusted based on, things that we missed, or the things that, people really, need to have done. So we're going to remain open to that. So that isn't closed by any means. In terms of, and for instance, even like, excuse me, on the trains, we wanted to maintain the 8-car trains, again, for the social distancing aspect, some of it demand, but as much on the health side of it, right? So that's why we also proposed that. I think, in terms of, you raise a very large, a very tough issue for us. If we actually end up laying off 2,400 people, and when that goes through the process, particularly on the representative side, the union side, where it's based on seniority, and people start bumping down, right? As we lose, obviously, bus operators, train operators, but particularly concern, engineers, mechanical, electrical, right? Systems people, IT people, all those people, very difficult, both, in the marketplace, to get some of them back. Now they have the right to come back first, as we do that. So that works in our favor, to a degree. This is a good place to work. I think that works in our favor. So I think we can pull some of them back, but it depends on how long that goes, right? And what other options they have, on the personal level and their own financial pressures. But that is a big concern. If we start to lose a lot of talented people, and then, to be frank, also on the retirement side, we had to do the incentive program because we're trying to save people in jobs, but you also lose a lot of talent, when people retire, as you know. So that is a real challenge for us. There's no doubt about it. And then even when we do bring people back, as you know, again, Devin, in a lot of these positions, you need to be certified. It's not something you can just walk in the next day and say, okay, well, I did this, 6 months ago. That's not the way it works, right? So that we have to build all that back into that as well. So that is some of the complexity that we're working through. How do we minimize that exposure? But I cannot minimize that exposure. It's there, and it's not, again, it's not only us. Every transit agency across the country is wrestling with this. Amtrak, I'm sure, is wrestling with it. How do you deal with this financial pressure we're under? At the same time, we're going to have a lot of pressure to get back up as quick as we can, and yet have to find the people to do it. So it's a very, very difficult, road for us for that part of it.
Thank you. I don't know if that translates to certain capacity limits that we're going to have, or if you know that or not. But that's something we certainly need to watch, because yes, we want to be able to expand and help the region get back on its feet as much as possible, but you're still limited to what you can do, right? There's only so much overtime you can give out there, and for certain positions, that's not even an option with hours of service. So, or lack thereof, but still it's a safety concern. And you did also touch on the fact that rail riders, we have different sets of rail riders out there. And again, that's such a huge percentage of revenue that ends up being part of the budget here. And, there's certain ones that are dependent on it. And they're a very important element that we can't forget. But then you mentioned the discretionary riders, right? And that's a hard element to win back in these types of environments. And so now there's a large percentage of those people that have a choice. And so you're trying to balance the need of providing the service to those who truly need it in these times, but also how do you get back those discretionary riders who are important to the overall revenue streams for such a large system that has a lot of fixed costs associated with maintenance of it. And that's, again, why past few meetings I've always been stressing to be innovative during these times, because how are you going to get back to people? One way is looking at things like overall trip time. And we haven't really changed our operational models ever since the systems existed. And maybe this is the time to look at that, especially if you have the leniency of the headways now, right? You're not trying to shove a train through a tunnel over 2 minutes or 3 minutes, depending on what's practically possible. This may be a chance to try to figure out other ways you might be able to encourage people to come back, because there's got to be an incentive, right? You can get in your car and travel the same distance in the same time, at the same cost or less. What's the incentive? And so as the region gets back to recovery and as traffic starts to grow again, especially with the larger percentage of people choosing to go to the car first, what ways can we try to be innovative in a way to get passengers, give them that incentive, whether it's trip time or something else? So I'm just going to keep making that point, because I do think it's important to make the best of this situation.
No, I totally agree with you. I think right now that's not their concern. It's more the safety part of it. But you're right. In that transition period, that's really where we need to think of that. All right, now what is the added benefit of using this system now for you? And you're right. So we are exploring those, just so you know. And you're right, with the type of headways we're talking, you have more options. If we run a full service, then those options of running, some more express or whatever you want to call it, that doesn't work. But we do have probably a little bit more flexibility given the headways that we're talking about.
That's all I have. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks. Next is Ms. Gideby.
Yes, I want to echo my appreciation for the presentation today, and maybe ground my thoughts. It's been interesting to hear about a lot of the political conversations that have happened to date. I want to ground a lot of my comments on the conversations that I've been having with community leaders, in addition to our Rider Advisory Committee members, and just having a discussion about what these implications mean. I think that 2020 has daylighted the things that we've turned a blind eye to, and I'm really encouraged that this board has taken a leadership position to really ensure that we are addressing any of the inequities that we've been able to see in the system more clearly because of the COVID-19 pandemic, which was beyond our control, and been able to adjust to ensure that we are really addressing and in real time prioritizing the things that we haven't done for decades. That includes ensuring that we have bus standards, right? And ensuring that the system works both on Metro Rail and for Metro Bus, which we haven't prioritized for years. It's been interesting to hear about the capital improvements that we're trying to focus on Metro Rail, as we say that we want to cut by 20% and get to a place with our numbers in that sense. I think that this is a real opportunity to really provide a new vision for the system, especially as we recognize that people have choices. And I think it's important for us to really amplify and share that message that we've been working to build back better for the return of riders. And it's been so true in everything that we've been doing since the summertime shutdowns, the station updates, even the thing that everyone complains about often, which is the escalators, right? We've been ensuring that Metro is ready for folks when they want to and feel ready to return as part of those pieces. And I'm not sure that this budget as it stands now that we're rushing to put out for public comment speaks to that piece. And I hope that in the coming weeks, we may just take a moment to really pause before we go for public comment to speak about the ways that we are really ensuring and thinking about how we can incentivize different options because people have choices. Because this is a conversation in which we are describing a budget for the summer of 2021, I think it takes, maybe does not put into consideration the opportunities to focus on who's using the system now, not just who's coming, but also prioritizing the opportunities that people can have. By saying that we want to get this out by December for something that is for the summer, especially because a portion of why I'm hearing the concern is so that the jurisdictions can have the information. And hearing the questions that you've given to my colleagues, the jurisdictions now have the information that they need. I guess I'm just wondering, can we take a moment to just ensure that we have all of the opportunities and options on the table as the Senate and Congress goes into lame duck? Why do we have to go to public comment in December? Can we wait until January? Last year, we did a similar wait and we were still able to meet the timelines that you guys have laid out, which is to get everything done still by March, meet the opportunities for what has to be laid out by April to ensure that we get the funding that we need, because we don't need any more of a gap there. And there are so many unknowns. I think we can all live and explain how we've been able to deal with all of the uncertainty of this year. And I think as we're coming to the close of this year, there are things that are just, there's more certainty in our democracy, in the notion of the public health as vaccines are coming out. And in addition to understanding that we may have a new congressional reality, both in the House and potentially in the Senate, I don't know why we need to rush to share a budget that is drastic, as we've all said. And I recognize that this is a hard time and that we are going to have hard choices to make. And this board is familiar with doing that. And I'm proud that we have been able to also make both the cuts that we needed and also judiciously put the services that we need back. But I think it's short-sighted in being able to really provide a new narrative for how we are really addressing this new normal. I think the thought process that we're going to be extending, or this budget will start in the summer, and we have our service hours for 5 to 9 p.m. as though it's normal business as usual, versus really thinking about actually looking at later services just because of the reality that people will want to get out of their homes. And if they are having an opportunity to make a choice as to getting in their car, we incentivize them to actually come take Metro with their family. That we really think about how we support tourism over in providing the weekend services that are required, because we're probably not going to need, that 9 to 5 traditional service as part of that. Maybe really kind of thinking about how we are also just making the case that some things are worth preserving, because Metro truly is an economic engine for this region. And thank the people who've been riding Metro. It has been amazing to see the folks who have been consistently still showing up, not just because they don't have any options, but because they also believe that Metro is safe. How are we telling their stories? It's been beautiful to see Teresa on my screen and all of the employees who have been putting their life on the lines to ensure that Metro works for each of us every single day. And I am deeply grateful. And there are riders who are doing the same. This is going to be a word of mouth campaign, that it does feel safe, that you can return. There is nothing that's stopping anyone from returning to Metro today. It is safe. We are able to provide all of the essential services in terms of the pandemic, right? We're giving out masks. We're making sure that people can socially distance appropriately. And I think it's important for us to tell that story versus letting folks have to plan for the reality that you won't be able to get anywhere on the weekends or at night. That's not the right message for this moment. I think we need to have a little bit more of a visionary space. I also think that as we go into the new year, we all have created an opportunity of putting on extra pounds. And I think being able to encourage folks to get out of their house, walk to Metro, take the bus, and be able to explore their city again that they love. I think it's an opportunity to really emphasize the notion of sustainability, that we should not be getting in our cars, that for our planet, it's why we should be taking Metro. And for all of those reasons, I think we've lost the bigger message of the things that we've been working on so deeply as a board for the last year since I've been on this board, but also for the last 4 years. So I hope that we can really kind of think about the type of message that we want to put out when we go to public comment that really speaks to what we are doing, not just what we're cutting, and ensure that we emphasize that we're ready for you right now. And because people have a choice to do something different, we want to take the opportunity to incentivize that choice. So that's really where I am. My questions are, how are we encouraging folks to return if it is about choice? How are we incentivizing people to make different choices, to not get in their car based off of what has been proposed? And how are we going to ensure that we fully understand the conversations around who is using the system right now and preserving what they may need? I think those are my biggest pieces, and I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Thank you. Paul, do you want to respond to that, or?
I mean, just a few comments. I mean, I agree with you that, again, this is Paul Wheatfield, General Manager, that, yeah, no, we need to get, people to come back and use the system. So we have, as you mentioned, we have been doing a number of things. And in fact, we're finding that basically that message is getting through. Literally, we've been monitoring, that the people are getting that. But we also have a good portion of our customer base that says, we get all that, right? But we're still afraid to use it for their own I mean, they're making a personal decision. So we got to keep that message. I get it. We're going to continue to do that. But at the end of the day, a certain segment of our customer base is telling us, we're just not coming back yet. So we have to face that reality. And in terms of, again, I think that's why we want to go out to the public. We want to hear more of that, right? So that we can adjust, so that we can say, okay, well, maybe we're not shutting down at 9, we're doing 11, but then we got to find the dollars to do it. So either the dollars need, hopefully, if we get the federal dollars, we can start to, basically react from what we're hearing from the public as the dollars are coming in, and we can adjust. If the revenue at the end of the ridership goes up, it does the same thing, of course. But, I think probably in the short term, it's the federal dollars. If we get those federal dollars, then we can start, again, sort of the messaging gets much stronger if you can provide the higher level service. But you need the dollars to do that. And I don't see that coming from the fare box. And that's the issue. That's why we need these federal dollars to do that. And then if hopefully they come through, then we can definitely revisit the exact things you're hitting upon. Because now let's use those dollars to say, look, here's the operation, use it, right? But right now, with the dollars we have, we can't project that. And that's why we need, again, to keep the pressure as much as we can, get these federal dollars, both in the short term and hopefully, in the spring or whatever, with the new administration.
So can you hit the limitations as to why we have to do it next week in December while Congress is still in lame duck? If it really is about the federal government, why can't we wait until our next board meeting in January, where we'll have a better sense of what has happened and what hasn't, so that we can make a better case, so that we are not saying, here's a $500 million cut that's limiting us as it relates to the summer, when people can make a lot of different options and there are a lot of more information that we'll have. If we're saying that we really want to put everything on the table so that we're making the best decision of what we're putting to the public, what is the sense of urgency for us to go? I mean, I don't know anyone who's saying I'm for this. So I think the comments will probably be clear. Why can't we give ourselves more time to ensure that we fully know where we are and still meet the deadlines that are being laid out? Because I think we can do both by just waiting until January to ensure that we have a better sense of what needs to happen from here.
This is what we'd have felt. I mean, there's another way to come at it, which is that, again, we're not doing the public hearings until January. So what we're asking for is the approval to start that process, to get all that lined up. And so if we have more dollars, another way to look at it is, now we have more dollars, public, what do you want? What do you want? And so we know this is what we were moving towards because we didn't have the dollars. Now, assuming that we get more dollars, now we're out to the public saying, all right, now these dollars, you tell us what you want versus me coming back out with something. I think it actually, enhances the public outreach by saying, this is where we are. Now, hopefully in the next 2-3 weeks, whatever the number is, dollars come through. And now we're out to the public and say, now you have these dollars. Where do you want us to put them? I think that's a more engaging way to get the public.
but we'll be basing it off of the $500 million, and we can't equate for those pieces in this current analysis that we'll put out. We'll have to wait to do that in March when we've done all the Title VI analysis, when we've heard all the feedback, and when we can't incorporate those two pieces together.
Not
I guess
necessarily.
I guess I'm just asking for the board to consider us just waiting until January. If there's no limitation for why we can't do those things, we can still have public comment in a robust one in both late January, early February. We'll have more of an understanding of what's happening as part of those pieces to just prioritize. I think
Well, that's a board decision. So, but the only thing I was trying to get across is, in the current debate, like this weekend, right? There's a possibility that, we could potentially get more money with this, with this compromise.
exactly.
And so that's not waiting until March. We will know as we go out to the public, again, here's what, if we didn't get those dollars, here's where we'd be. Now there's dollars. What do you want to do with them? I think that's a great way to go out to the public in January.
Okay. I would also say it's a self-fulfilling prophecy to some extent. If you're saying that, we have to cut services because of ridership, but yet we are cutting service because of ridership, it's kind of hard for us to be in this space because you're not incentivizing any reason for anyone to come back at this point. If anything, you're giving more people more options to really try to figure out how to get a car or other opportunities as part of those things. So just something for us to think about. If this is really about ridership and revenue, then we should really put a budget that talks about that. Can we offer some sort of incentive for people to actually come and see, to return, so that they know that they can come back? This is really about a choice. It's not that they can't come back today. We're ready to receive them right now. So can we offer a weekly pass? Because it's not like people are making different choices. They're not going to work. So is there an off-peak pass that we can offer? I just believe, like Devin had started to lay out, there are some more innovative pieces that we can probably really think to that incentivizes people to want to return. We're ready for them right now. The other piece that I want to touch on is just that notion of what Secretary Slater hit on, which is that Metro really does impact the region and is an economic driver. So even as we think about the contractors who are being cut, all of the employees, there is an intentional decision based off of what Metro decides it's going to do. So I just think that we should just really think about how we are proactively trying to keep all that we are. And I know that we're trying to do many of those things, but I think we need to maybe do a better job really kind of speaking to those things. And I don't want to disregard those who are using the service right now, because we need them just as well. And I think that this budget is only talking about who is not here versus who has been here, and also being able to acknowledge what that really looks like. Because again, Metro is safe, and it is time for people to return when they feel ready, but also that we're ready right now as part of those pieces. I want to make one more comment, and then Mr. Chair, I can turn it back over to you, which is I hear the conversation about the jurisdictional pieces of how many buses are we going to get. And I hope that as we do this analysis, that it really is about equity, not equality. That it's not just because I have 5, you should have 5. It should really be about where are people needing to go to and understanding that need. And who's most at need as part of that. I think as we go to the Silver Line Phase 2 conversation, I really want to understand the Title VI pieces that will be attached to that. And I think we'll be having a briefing on Thursday for that piece. But if we're adding, because I appreciated Jeff's question about the legislative exclusion, if we're adding Silver Line, which we've all agreed needs to be part of this system, there is an adverse effect on who's going to be able to, who is benefiting as part of that new line of service that is being received as part of that. And so I just want to make sure that we are really thinking about equity as it means to those who are most at need and who have been dependent on the system, and also ensuring that the system continues to operate as it has been to date. And we want to thank them for that as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Gideby. And if we can talk further about the timeline, I'm personally convinced that it makes sense to continue on the schedule we've put out. There is substantial staff work that's required once the board provides direction on getting the public comment process rolling. There is time to execute that process. And then once we come up with our ultimate budget decisions, then there's an implementation, and particularly with the workforce and lining up equipment and communicating routes, things like that. But we don't have to resolve that today. This is an information session, but I think there are good reasons to start the process now, recognizing that adjustments will be made along the way as they have been in 21. Anyway, with that, I'll move on to Mr. Goldman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the general manager staff for their presentation this morning. It does reflect a lot of time and effort that they've put into it. Unfortunately, my conclusion is that they've put this through the budgetary sausage machine. You've produced something which is inedible, and inedible to the point that I wouldn't want to put it out to the public for comment at this time. I think the ridership revenue forecast for fiscal year 22, as I've said before, is too conservative. It causes too much pain. And I don't think it's one that we should present to the public. At this time, I join with Ms. Gideby in feeling that waiting a month, we're going to learn something by December 18th, whether Congress is going to pass a transit relief bill and provide us with some money. And by the end of the year, we're going to learn from the FDA whether they have approved the vaccines from Pfizer and Moderna, and I get a better fix on what the schedule is for those vaccines. And I think that's going to have a big impact, both of those things, on this budget and what the environment is going to look like by July of next year. But let me be a little more specific. I think ridership and revenue should be recovering by July 2021 with the vaccine more available. The federal officials running the vaccine program seem to think that 70 or 80% of the population will have an opportunity to have a vaccine by the summer. Director Redford of the Center for Disease Control, just yesterday on CNBC, when asked when he thinks things will return to normal, said he predicted that the country won't be able to return to holding large gatherings until the fall of 2021. That's the fall of next year, is when he's saying things are going to be a lot better. So I would have targeted recovery to 65 or 70% of pre-COVID levels by the end of the fiscal year 2022, so these steep cuts don't be made. So that's a difference of going from roughly 33 million riders per quarter to probably 56 million. And that produces, those riders will produce a lot more revenue, and that'll be helpful, as I will try to describe in what I would hope we could try to achieve. So we've been very critical of this administration over the last year for not following the science. And I think we should now be following the science, and the science and the scientists seem to be telling us that things are going to be a lot better by next summer, the start of this fiscal year. And we should reflect that optimism, or that more realistic forecast, in my view, in what we are projecting for this fiscal year. Because if we have more revenue, we can do some better things. And by more revenue, I just don't mean by projecting more ridership in their revenues. I would also favor some added revenue by charging peak fares all day and just calling it a normal fare. We should be a little creative here. With carrying 20% of rail riders, we don't have any peaks. So why should we charge a peak fare? Let's just call it a normal fare and increase our revenue that way. So with this higher revenue, I think rail headways, should be able to move them closer to the 15-minute headways that we will be running for January through June of 2021. That's really what we're going to be offering our ridership for the next 6 months, and we should be striving to try and retain that pattern into the summer and fall of the year as well. And I don't see why we shouldn't be able to have a forecast that does that. If we project more revenue, if we can raise more revenue from fares, then we should be able to come closer to the 15-minute headways that we're going to be offering for the next 6 months, and add back in some weekend rail service as well. Next, I'm opposed to closing the 19 stations as proposed. I would prefer to keep the station open for riders. And if we need to save money, then leave them without staff. But I think if we're expecting ridership to start coming back next summer or next fall, to present them with 19 closed stations that they can't use, which was their regular commuting pattern, is just an exercising and shooting ourselves in the foot. So I would prefer to keep those stations opened and unmanned rather than closed to riders. And it also makes no sense in being parochial and talking about the Red Line to have a turn back at Grosvenor if Grosvenor is going to be closed as a station. That makes no sense to have turnbacks at a station that's going to be closed to riders. So I would favor keeping stations opened and unmanned. I just don't support, furloughing another 2,400 employees when there are things that we can do to project more revenue in the system so that we don't have to tell these people that they're going to lose a job come next July 1, especially as the secretary pointed out, the majority of these people live in Maryland. So it's a matter of special concern for me as a representative of the state of Maryland. Let me just talk about Metrobus a little bit. I've heard back a little bit from the county on the impact of the proposed Metrobus changes in the county. And the bottom line here is, if the Red Line is really going to be closed at 9 p.m. on weekdays with no weekend service, then what's needed from Metrobus is that it parallel the bus line of the Red Line with bus service from Friendship Heights to Shady Grove. You've talked about adding bus service on the Red Line to compensate for the lack of service or the longer headways, but those additional bus routes seem to have stopped at the district line. There's no proposal for added service in Maryland along Wisconsin Avenue and Rockville Pike, if you really want to go forward with those kind of just horrible Metro Rail service on the Red Line. Finally, on bus, I want to just point out something that no one's alluded to before, but the county has pointed out to me. Dropping bus service on like the Z routes, the Z2, and I apologize to my Virginia friends for being so parochial and specific. The Z2, which runs out on Colesville Road, Route 29, the L8, which runs on Connecticut Avenue beyond the district line, and T2, which runs out on River Road and then on Falls Road up to Rockville. If you cut those routes out of the Metro bus service plan, it has a dramatic impact on Metro access eligibility, because Metro access eligibility, I'm told, is limited to 3/4 of a mile from a Metro bus route. So if you take Metro bus service out of Connecticut Avenue in Maryland, out of portions of Colesville Road, out of River Road in the western part of Montgomery County, then people living in those areas are then going to be cut off from their eligibility for Metro access service. So that's another point that would go to reconsidering some of these changes. In terms of revenue, I just want to raise another issue here. Maybe we can raise some revenue with kind of a one-time sale of surplus small lot properties that Metro holds throughout the region, but does not need for transit-oriented development. I'm quite aware that there are odd lots in the portfolio. There are vacant or semi-used lots that were bought up in the original construction and now are vacant or unused, or parking lots. But why don't we sort of package these together and see, maybe an offering to the public of some of these odd lot properties. It might be another way to raise some additional revenue for this fiscal year that could be used to, reduce the headways on Metro Rail and provide some improved bus service. One example, just to give you a specific example is out Connecticut Avenue. We have this turnaround at the end of Connecticut Avenue in the district where there's a little waiting room for bus riders on the L routes. You know, maybe Dunkin' Donuts or Starbucks would find that a very good location for a new franchise out there. And there might be other business opportunities as well that we should look for to try and raise some revenue to help close this budget gap so it doesn't result in being closed by reducing rail service, by cutting bus service, and by firing our bus operators and our train operators. But this is supposed to be an informational session. So I'll finish up with asking two questions of the general manager and the people who put together the budget. You've just mentioned that on the rail side, the budget projects that rail, I guess, service will be at 20% of pre-COVID levels, which was frightening in itself, since we're carrying about 20% of pre-COVID level passengers right now and would expect to be carrying much more increasingly throughout this fiscal year, starting in the summer. But my question is, does that 20% mean 20% for the existing legacy rail system, metro rail system? Or is that 20% number include the Silver Line 2 additional mileage that will be implemented during this fiscal year, during the fiscal year FY22? And you know, in other words, is your 20% number reflect overall metro rail operations levels that include Silver Line Phase 2, or does it just reflect what the levels of service will be on the, what we'll call the legacy metro rail system that is currently operating before Silver Line 2 kicks in summer or fall of next year, 2021? That's the first question. The second question is that on the Metrobus side, your original, I guess, presentation anticipated that the Metrobus changes would save about $159 million, $160 million. But in the most recent version, it's only $105 million. So your savings have decreased by about $55 million, which I assume reflects some added levels of bus service that were added in from the so-called the original June service levels. So could you expand a little bit upon that and discuss what's been added in terms of bus service over the June level that reflects this reduced savings of about $55 million in Metrobus service levels?
Mr. Goldman, this is Paul Wiedefeld, General Manager. Let me just, I'm going to clarify a few issues, and on your two specific questions, I'm not sure if, I don't have it off the top of my head. Maybe there's someone, Peter or Joe, may be able to give direct answers to those. But let me just clarify a few things that you said. One, in terms of Metro Access, we are not cutting Metro Access and its service area. So the same service area that it serves today, it will serve under the proposed budget.
Yeah, but my understanding is that if there's not a Metrobus line on the avenue,
but we're
then
not,
those people are not eligible for Metro
no,
Access service.
we are going to keep it eligible. That's my point.
Ah, okay.
That's my
So you're
point.
going to make some kind of an exception.
Exactly. Exactly.
Gotcha. Okay.
The service they have today, they will have regardless of where the bus line stops. Okay, so let's.
Okay, that's very helpful for those who
That's
need
right.
that for access service. Thank you for that clarification.
Yep. And then on surplus property, as you recall, we've been working on that for the last 2 years. So we're going to continue to do that. We have estimated additional surplus sales in the 22 budget. So we want to continue to do that. And you're right. I mean, if there's the market for it, then, then we should explore it, and we will continue to do that. And then the third, one of the other comments you made is that on the rail, we're running roughly 20% of the ridership. We've been really between 10 and 12% for the last, few months. So there may be spikes at different times, but overall that average has been in that 12% range. So I don't want to overestimate, that ridership, just so that we're all clear on that.
Yeah, I appreciate that correction. I thought we had.
I'm not correct. I just want to make sure.
About,
Yeah, just so that the public understand.
15 or 20%.
All right, and I don't know, Peter, or if you're on the line, or anyone, if we can answer those two questions directly, or if we can get back to the board on the answer to those two specific questions in terms of the 20%, whether it includes Silver Line Phase 2 or not, or the other one. So hearing none, it sounds like we will have to get back to you on that, just to be clear, because I don't.
Okay,
want to
Peter's on. Peter's is still muted, so I don't know if he had a comment then.
Okay, yes, I had a microphone problem. So yes, Peter Cafiero, Managing Director of Intermodal Planning. The 20% is looking at car mileage, and that's not including Silver Line 2. So that's to the existing system.
Because the existing system will be at 20%. Pre-COVID.
And of course, that's 0% on weekends. It's more in weekdays. It's averaged across the week. On the bus side, we were given some additional resources in the budget process as some adjustments were made. And what we did was to go back to the June service plan, which was sort of our base. If you recall that, it had almost no weekend service. And combining that with no rail weekend service, we really had some major challenges transportation-wise on weekends. And we also really wanted to concentrate the service where existing ridership was. And we made some changes in our route structure to try to be as efficiently as possible, serving as much of the region as we could. So those were the changes that were made from the preliminary look at this to the current proposal.
So no, I appreciate that, but I appreciate again, as I said, that you take a look at that along the red line. That seems to be an obvious candidate where if you're going to add bus service on the weekend, since you're not going to have red line rail service, that should have been something that was added originally to that June plan that you're describing.
We do have a weekend extension of the 33 route up to Bethesda to cover the portion of the red route. It's clearly not the whole
Yeah.
line.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Goldman. We, I think, all appreciate creative thinking and focus on some of the potential unintended consequences when we're dealing with a proposal of change of this magnitude. Last, we will go to Mr. Letourneau.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. So I think it's fair to say, as others have, that nobody likes this. Nobody is in favor of this. The general manager is not in favor of this, I'm quite certain. But unfortunately, this is not Sim City, and we can't just print money and assume money that is not there. I don't necessarily have quite the level of optimism that others do about the ability of Congress to act quickly to deliver funding to us in time for our fiscal year. And some of the numbers being bantied about are nowhere close to what we would need to be able to actually close our gap. May help some, but I think we have to be prudent and conservative in our estimates. And I'm a little frustrated with some of the tenor of this conversation, because the assumptions that are going into this budget are not new to the board. We told the general manager to take a conservative approach, and there was pretty much unanimity with that in terms of the board direction. So I don't think that's necessarily the issue. I do think that we need a lot more information to be able to make specific decisions about a lot of these things. And so I will ask for staff to provide the board as much as possible on specific line by line items that are included in this budget. For instance, what is exactly the savings associated with shutting down stations? How much per station? What's the savings associated with these, the red line turnbacks, the silver line phase 2 changes, the yellow line changes, and so on through all the different pieces that are in this budget. I think only with that information can we really have the ability to do some of our own math and be able to make decisions that would help us to decide, what should stay and what should go and what we can put back. Because right now, without those specific pieces, it would be very difficult for us to do that. Speaking about Virginia specifically for a moment, I don't think the issue is necessarily that everybody needs to be equal in terms of how many routes you have and what the level of service is. But I also think the argument for some of the route reductions and bus route reductions is not that there's not a need, even from an equity standpoint. It's that there potentially is local service that could pick up those routes. And that would be fine if there was also a reduction in the subsidy required by those jurisdictions to pay for metro service so that they could afford to pay for that service. But the same issues that are affecting metro are also affecting the local jurisdictions who provide their own bus service. And so the ability of those jurisdictions to fund some of that bus is equally as in doubt as it is for metro. And so that is really where my concern is. Certainly, if you were to look at the map, that's the last piece of this presentation, and you look at where the bus routes are, there are not many in Virginia left. There's probably about 6 lines that are here. And again, it's not about what the number is necessarily, but you can't tell me that there is not a need in there for that service. It's just that there's decisions and discussions about who's going to provide it. But I heard loud and clear last night. We had the opportunity for the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission to meet, well-timed or poorly timed, depending on one's perspective. But that allowed all of the regional leaders in Virginia that are members of the commission, the elected leaders, to give me input on what's been proposed so far. And that was one of the major concerns, their ability to provide local bus service at a level that makes up for what the metro cuts will be. So that's one issue. Another major issue, not surprisingly, was on the rail side, the investment that's being made in the Silver Line, and yet it appears that it's being treated differently than all the other lines because it's the only one that truly is stopping. It isn't having a continuation of service. It's obviously, we haven't opened phase 2 yet, so we don't have ridership projections. But given the level of investment that was made, given the land use decisions that have been made in that corridor, and given the amount of investment that's gone on, it's certainly a difficult pill to swallow to suggest that those stations should be treated differently than every other one in the system. And so that was another loud and clear concern that was expressed by the Virginia elected officials last night at MVTC. So I will just put those things out there for future discussion. I am personally quite concerned on the capital budget side. I think that aspect of this budget proposal is not getting enough attention. It's very easy for us to discuss route changes and service changes and be focused on what we're hearing from riders, which is all very legitimate. But I do think there are long-term implications for moving preventive maintenance costs onto the capital side that A, costs us more money in the long run for sure, and B, reduces our ability to make capital investments. And that isn't just rail, that includes bus. So that is a concern. Now, I understand why it's here. They had to come up with 160 million. And if this wasn't here, that would be more service cuts. But I think as we look at things to add back, this should be high on our radar screen as things proceed. I would want us to see as little as possible of this preventive maintenance being carried on the capital budget through new debt. It is not a good fiscal practice to be in, and I think staff would agree with that. I think, again, they were solving for a problem that they had to, but we should not lose sight of that as much as possible. the final thing I'll maybe say is, there's been some notion that this budget proposal is sort of a scare tactic designed to get Congress to do something. It is scary, but it's a real budget proposal based on real numbers, based on, ridership assumptions that we've discussed at length. None of us know exactly what's going to happen on the ridership side. I agree with what a lot of others have said about finding ways to see if we can incentivize back some ridership through different types of fare packages and policies. I would agree that we should encourage staff to get creative and think a little bit about that. One of the things that I've been pushing actually at MVTC, and then for a little bit on this board, although we haven't had much of a chance to, has been a weekend sort of family fare pass. Now, obviously, if we have no weekend rail service, that's not going to do us any good. But it is not cost efficient right now for a family of any kind of size like mine to take Metro, because you're spending $4 to $6 from the outer stations per person, per child. And at that point, for $24, you could easily drive and park in the city for the day, if you're especially coming in for a weekend. And so I do think those types of things are out there that could help us bring back some ridership, and we should be pursuing them. But this is a crisis budget, so it's the discussion we're having is a little bit different. So I'm looking forward to, I don't know if I'm looking forward to it, but a necessary part of this is for us to get into this nitty gritty and get into the details. The one question I'll ask the general manager is, when we went through the FY21 process, staff put out for public consideration a number, quite frankly, that was larger than what we thought we would need in order to give the board some room to maneuver and potentially put some things back in, which we were able to do, and plus combined with an improvement in conditions. Are you comfortable at this point? Right now, if going back to the chart where you have a number that's meeting exactly what the cut level is, are you comfortable that that's not going to get any worse, and that we wouldn't have to put even more out there for consideration? And are you comfortable that the board may ultimately have some flexibility on some of these items because things might improve?
To your second part, I'm hoping that things do improve, and yes, we can pull back. In terms, am I comfortable? Yes, but we have to recognize the two things in there that I don't control. We can't just do on our own. One is that the unions they forego their salary. That's not 19 million, and the other is that the locals meet the 3% growth rate, which again, as you know, is a real tough lift. So that's
Is the union, so is the first part of that in terms of salary, is that baked into your proposal already? Or
it
no?
is. Yeah.
Oh,
When
it is.
that,
Okay,
yeah.
I missed that. I'm sorry.
No, yeah. That's assumed that they're going to go along with that.
So what is the budgetary impact if they don't?
19.3, 19.5 million, if I recall.
Okay. All right. So that is so there was a different number that we were discussing at one point over the last couple of weeks, higher than this. I think the two changes then that got us to this 490, whatever it is, right. 494, it must be that 19.3 and then the whatever 20
and the 3% from the locals.
Yeah, and I'm doing my best to try to solicit feedback on that 3% in terms of the Virginia localities. One of the reasons I do think it's important for us to move forward with this budget process now is because we need that information on the 3% subsidy and the ability of all the jurisdictions, not just the Virginia ones, but Maryland and DC as well, to meet that. And in order to do that, we have to get going on our budget. I mean, our budgetary staff for most of these jurisdictions are already telling us that we're behind and that they're upset that we haven't provided them with better guidance. So because usually by this point we have. So I think we do need to move forward. I also think by the time we go out to public input, if we start this process and a vote next week, it will allow for the end of the year and for some of these potential things that may happen and we hope happen with Congress to already be taken into account by the time we actually go out to input. So I don't have a concern with that, since there's a lag between when the board takes action and when we actually will go out. But that piece of it's very important on that 3%, obviously, and there is concern with some elected officials that they may not be able to actually give us that. So that just makes our whole worse. But I appreciate all the work from staff on this, and obviously we're going to have a very difficult process ahead of us to try to work through this.
All right, thank you, Mr. Letourneau. So having gone through a full round of questions with the entire board, I'll go ahead and close discussion for today's meeting. This is obviously the beginning of a long conversation amongst the board and with the community. And we'll continue to consider all of the various things raised today. So with that, with no further business before the committee, we will stand adjourned. We'll reconvene next Thursday for in this committee and also the full board and other committees as well. So thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you.